Think about this. A story written thousands of years ago by people who believed the sun revolved around the earth can still make grown adults angry today. Not curious, not thoughtful, angry. People will lose friendships, families, even their lives, just to defend stories they didn't write, can't verify, and often haven't even read carefully. Why? Why do humans defend ancient stories as if their survival depends on it? Because in a strange way, it does. And once you see why, you'll never look at belief, tradition, or identity the same way again. Stories were never just stories. We like to imagine ancient stories as entertainment, myths, legends, old books, something created to pass time around a fire, something optional. But originally, stories were not art. They were survival tools. Before science existed, before governments claimed authority, before laws told people how to behave, stories were how humans made sense of a world that felt hostile, unpredictable, and alive with danger. When the sun rose every morning, people did not see astronomy, they saw intention. When storms destroyed villages, they did not see weather systems, they saw anger. When death arrived suddenly and without explanation, they did not see biology, they saw meaning. Stories explained why things happened when nothing else could. They told people who was in control when no one actually was. They gave chaos a face and fear a reason, and that mattered more than accuracy. Because a world with an explanation feels safer than a world without one. Even a wrong explanation feels better than none at all. When a story explains your suffering, you do not just believe it, you cling to it. You repeat it, you teach it to your children, because without it, the world goes quiet in the worst possible way. No answers, no comfort, no guarantees. Imagine losing a child and being told there is no reason, no plan, no justice waiting on the other side. For early humans, that was unbearable. A story that said this pain has meaning was not just comforting, it was necessary. It allowed people to keep going, to wake up the next morning, to survive psychologically when reality was too heavy to carry raw. Stories were emotional shelter. And once a story protects you during your darkest moment, something changes inside the brain. The story stops being information and starts becoming safety. It becomes linked to relief, to stability, to survival itself. So when that story is questioned later, the brain does not respond calmly. It reacts the way it would if someone tried to tear down the walls of your house during a storm. It panics. It defends. It resists. That is the unsettling part most people never notice. Once a story saves you once, your brain begins saving the story. Not because it is true, but because it worked. And from that moment on, the story is no longer just something you believe. It is something you protect, at all costs. The brain doesn't defend truth. It defends identity. Here is the uncomfortable truth most people never want to face. Humans do not defend stories because they are true. They defend them because they are theirs. A belief is rarely just an idea floating in the mind. It becomes stitched into how you see yourself. It shapes your sense of right and wrong. It tells you what kind of person you are trying to be. It gives you a role in the universe that feels meaningful instead of random. Over time, the story stops being something you hold. It becomes something that holds you. That is why questioning a belief feels so different from questioning a fact. When someone challenges a story you are emotionally invested in, your brain does not hear curiosity. It does not hear an invitation to think. It hears a threat, not to logic, to identity. The question feels personal even when it is not meant to be. It feels like someone is pulling at a thread that keeps your inner world together. And the brain reacts exactly as it would to any perceived attack, with speed, with defensiveness, with emotion. This is why debates about belief rarely stay calm for long. Logic stops working because logic is not what is being protected. Emotions take over because emotions are the alarm system. The brain interprets belief loss as identity loss. And identity loss feels like death on a psychological level. Not dramatic death, but disappearance. Who am I if this story is wrong? What was all of that for? Where do I stand now? These questions are not abstract. They are destabilizing. So the mind does what it evolved to do. It fights to survive. That fight can look like anger. It can look like ridicule. It can look like sudden certainty where doubt once existed. The brain will reach for anything that restores stability. Even denial feels safer than free fall. This is not stupidity, it is self-preservation. Your mind learned long ago that belonging and identity keep you alive. Losing them once meant isolation. And isolation once meant death. But here is the deeper layer most people never see. This reaction did not start with modern belief systems. It goes much further back, long before written stories, long before organized belief. The brain learned that survival depended on shared narratives, and once identity fused with those narratives, defending them became instinct. And that is where everything starts to get dangerous. Ancient stories gave humans control over fear. Imagine living in a world with no explanations at all, no medicine to tell you why the fever will not break, no weather forecasts to warn you the storm is coming, no understanding of infection, disease, or chance. When a child dies suddenly, you do not ask how it happened. You ask why it happened. Why this child? Why now? Why us? Those questions demand answers, and silence is the cruelest answer of all. Ancient stories stepped into that silence. They did not arrive with accuracy. They arrived with confidence, and confidence feels like control. A story that says this happened for a reason is emotionally stronger than a truth that says it did not. When people were told the gods were angry, or testing them, or teaching a lesson, the pain became structured. The fear became understandable. Suffering stopped feeling random. And randomness is what humans fear most. Control does not require correctness, it only requires certainty. Even today, certainty is more comforting than truth. That is why people will choose a wrong answer over the words, "I do not know." Because "I do not know" means the ground beneath you is unstable. It means the world does not owe you fairness. It means the next disaster could arrive without warning or meaning. And the human nervous system is not built to live calmly inside that thought. Ancient stories created the illusion that someone was steering the chaos, that someone was watching, deciding, controlling outcomes. Even punishment felt safer than randomness because punishment implied order. It implied rules. Follow them and you are protected. Break them and you understand why you suffer. The story became a map in a dangerous world. When modern thinking begins to remove those explanations, something old wakes up. The fear returns. Not intellectual fear, but primal fear. The fear of being alone in an indifferent universe. The fear that nothing is watching, that nothing guarantees meaning. So when science replaces certainty with probability, and stories with statistics, many people do not feel relief. They feel exposed. And that is why ancient certainty is defended so fiercely, because it does not just explain the past, it shields the mind from terror in the present, and fear, once awakened, does not let go easily. Questioning the story feels like betrayal. Here is something most people never say out loud. Belief is not just personal, it is tribal. Ancient stories did not simply explain the world, they bonded people together, families, clans, entire nations. Shared stories created shared identity. They drew invisible borders between who belonged and who did not. Us and them, safe and dangerous, familiar and foreign. When you grow up inside a story, that story becomes a social contract. It tells you who your people are, who you can trust, who you should fear. So when you question the story, you are not just thinking differently. You are stepping outside the group, and the human brain is wired to treat that as a serious threat. The brain fears exile more than it fears being wrong. Being wrong can be corrected. Being alone cannot. For most of human history, being cast out did not mean disagreement. It meant starvation, exposure, death. Survival depended on belonging, so doubt became dangerous, questioning became risky, silence became safer than honesty. That is why doubt feels shameful even when it is rational. That is why questioning feels like disloyalty instead of curiosity. The emotional reaction is not about ideas, it is about survival memory. Your brain does not care that you live in a modern society with safety nets and freedom of thought. It is running old software. It still treats rejection as a life-threatening event. This is also why communities often respond harshly to those who question shared beliefs, not because the questions are wrong, but because they destabilize the group. A single crack in the story threatens cohesion, and cohesion once meant life. So the group reacts the way organisms react to infection. It isolates, it attacks, it expels. Your brain remembers all of this. Not consciously, not logically, but emotionally. That is why stepping away from a shared story feels like betrayal even when no one is harmed. It feels like you are breaking an unspoken rule, leaving a circle that once kept you alive. And even when you know better, the fear lingers, because the body learned this lesson long before words ever existed. The older the story, the more sacred it feels. Here is a paradox that quietly controls human thinking. The less evidence a story has, the more fiercely it is often defended. That seems backward, but it happens for a reason. Age creates authority. When a belief has survived centuries, it begins to feel validated by time itself. If millions of people believed it before you, across generations and civilizations, who are you to question it? The thought alone can feel disrespectful, even dangerous. Ancient stories carry the weight of repetition. They have been spoken, memorized, ritualized, and protected for so long that they begin to feel permanent. And permanence feels like truth. But longevity does not equal accuracy. It equals survival. A story that is repeated often enough does not become true. It becomes familiar. And familiarity is deeply persuasive to the human mind. To challenge something old feels like arrogance because age signals wisdom in our psychology. Elders survived, traditions lasted, so we unconsciously assume there must be something right about what endured. Questioning it feels like standing on the shoulders of the dead and claiming you see better. Even when the evidence is weak, the emotional resistance is strong. This is why newer ideas are scrutinized while ancient ones are protected. New claims are asked to prove themselves. Old claims are asked to be respected. The standard is reversed. Evidence becomes optional when time itself is treated as proof. The story no longer has to justify itself. It simply points to its age and demands loyalty. Ancient stories also benefit from distance. The people who wrote them are gone. The context is blurred. The contradictions are softened by time. What remains is a polished relic, stripped of its original messiness. That distance makes the story harder to challenge because no one is there to contradict it directly. It becomes untouchable. And untouchable things feel powerful. Power creates reverence. Reverence discourages questions. So people defend ancient stories not because they are proven, but because they feel sacred. And sacred things are not examined, they are protected. The moment something feels above questioning, it stops needing truth. It only needs belief. Doubt threatens emotional investments. Think about what belief actually costs over a lifetime. Years of prayer whispered in moments of fear, obedience that required swallowing doubt, sacrifices made quietly while trusting it would all make sense later. Fear endured because it was framed as necessary, hope sustained because it promised meaning at the end. Belief is not free. It demands time, emotion, discipline, and sometimes suffering. Now imagine the story collapses. What happens to all of that effort? What happens to the nights spent praying instead of sleeping? The opportunities turned down. The choices made out of loyalty rather than desire. The pain that was tolerated because it was supposed to serve a purpose. It hurts to even consider that some of that suffering might not have been necessary, that it might not have been required at all. The brain does not like that thought, so it protects the investment. Psychologists call this loss aversion, but emotionally it feels much deeper than a technical term. It feels like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down at your own past. If this is not true, then what was all that for? That question is heavy. It threatens the meaning of years. It threatens the story you tell yourself about endurance and reward. Facing that pain requires courage most people were never taught to develop. It means accepting that you gave something precious to an idea that may not deserve it. That realization can feel more painful than continuing to believe. So many people choose defense instead. They double down. They reinforce the story. They interpret doubt as temptation or weakness rather than information. This reaction is often misunderstood as stubbornness or ignorance. But at its core, it is human. Letting go does not just mean changing your mind. It means grieving the version of yourself that believed. It means mourning the sacrifices you justified. And grief is uncomfortable, so the mind chooses the path that feels safer. It defends the story, not because it is weak, but because it is protecting years of emotional investment that once felt necessary to survive. Control disguised as morality. Ancient stories did more than explain reality. They told people how to behave. They defined what was right and what was wrong, who deserved honor, who deserved punishment, who was allowed power, and who was expected to obey. Over time, these stories stopped being descriptions of the world and became rule books for living inside it. Morality and narrative fused together. When a story controls morality, questioning it feels dangerous. People are not just afraid of being wrong, they are afraid of what happens if the rules disappear. If we abandon this story, what stops chaos? What keeps people from harming each other? What prevents society from collapsing into selfishness? These fears feel reasonable because the story has positioned itself as the source of order. But here is the quiet revelation that unsettles everything. Morality did not come from the story. The story came from morality. Long before written rules, humans survived through empathy, cooperation, and mutual protection. Groups that cared for each other survived. Groups that did not vanished. The instincts that keep communities alive existed first. Stories arrived later and wrapped themselves around those instincts. The story did not create goodness. It claimed ownership of it. It took natural human behaviors and presented them as commands. Obedience was framed as virtue. Disobedience was framed as evil. In doing so, morality became something granted from above rather than something emerging from human connection. This shift created power. Whoever controlled the story controlled the moral framework. And whoever controlled the moral framework could justify authority. Punishment felt righteous. Control felt necessary. Questioning the story became not just intellectual disagreement, but moral rebellion. Once people begin to see this, something changes. When ownership of morality is questioned, authority starts to wobble. If goodness does not belong to the story, then the story loses its leverage. And when leverage disappears, control weakens. That is why these stories are defended so fiercely. Not just because they explain the world, but because they justify who gets to rule it. What happens when the story finally breaks? Here is the part no one warns you about. When an ancient story finally loosens its grip, the first thing you feel is not relief, it is fear. Real fear. The kind that sits quietly in the chest. Confusion follows, then loneliness. A sense of free fall, like the ground you stood on your entire life, has quietly disappeared. The certainty that once wrapped everything in order is gone, and for a moment, nothing replaces it. This is where many people turn back, not because the story suddenly makes sense again, but because uncertainty feels unbearable. The mind searches for the old walls, the old answers, anything solid. But if you stay a little longer, something unexpected begins to appear. Curiosity. Without the story telling you what to think, questions stop feeling forbidden. You begin to look at the world directly instead of through inherited explanations. Freedom follows, not as comfort, but as responsibility. There is no script anymore, no pre-written meaning handed to you. You are no longer living inside someone else's narrative. You are writing your own. This is not the rejection of meaning, it is the refusal to outsource it. You begin to build values consciously instead of inheriting them unconsciously. You choose empathy because it makes sense, not because it is commanded. You choose honesty because it aligns with reality, not because it is rewarded later. Life feels sharper, heavier, more real. And yes, it is terrifying. There is no cosmic guarantee that everything will work out, no promise that suffering will be balanced by justice, but there is also something powerful in standing without illusions, in facing reality as it is, and deciding how to live anyway. When the story breaks, you do not lose yourself, you meet yourself. And that moment, as frightening as it is, marks the beginning of something most ancient stories never offered: intellectual freedom, emotional ownership, and a life chosen, not inherited. Humans don't defend ancient stories because they hate truth. They defend them because those stories once kept us safe. They gave structure to fear, order to chaos, belonging to loneliness. But we are no longer ancient humans. We have better tools now, better questions, and the courage to say, "I don't know, yet." Letting go of an old story isn't betrayal, it's growth. because the goal was never to protect the story. It was to understand ourselves, and if this made you uncomfortable, good. That's where thinking begins. If you value truth over comfort, curiosity over certainty, stay here. And keep questioning.